We have been, as you will recall, analyzing the subject of the voluntaristic church, the shift from the idea of an established church created by the state, financed by the state, to one that is a product of voluntarism, where people come together and create and establish the church by their faith, by their giving, so that it is not dependent upon the financing and the support of the church, but upon the people. And we saw that political order in the United States and every kind of social order was a product to varying degrees of this principle of voluntarism. Now, as we look at the political order and voluntarism, we must recognize that before the principle of voluntarism came in, the problem of civil government was relatively simple under monarchy. Monarchy has always offered a great deal of appeal, historically, to various peoples. Under a monarchy, authority is centralized, and the duty of the people is simply obedience. Moreover, it must be recognized that through a great deal of the history of mankind, men and nations have preferred monarchism. The idea of monarchism is still not gone. It survives in some areas. For example, in Austria, there is still a very sizable, highly intelligent group of Austrian Catholics who are monarchists. Their strength is so feared that there are certain restrictions upon the presence of the Habsburgs in Austria. Monarchy, thus, has always had a very obvious appeal. It simplifies the problem of government. It also makes it easier to ascribe guilt and credit. If you don't like the way things are going, there's one man to blame. It's King John or King George, wherever the case may be. It does simplify the issue as far as people are concerned, too. But when you have a shift from some such form of government as monarchism to a republic in the American tradition, certain problems immediately arise. You are shifting then from a given structure to a gathered structure. Now, these terms were originally used with regard to churches. The given church was the one that was already there. It was established by the church. It was a church that you owed authority to. You were in the parish. You paid the tithes automatically. You belonged to that parish because you resided within that parish. And everyone within that parish belonged to that particular church. But a gathered church was something different. In a gathered church, a group of people would gather themselves together in terms of a specific faith. And instead of coming from a parish and all being in the church because they were in that parish, they might come from a good many miles. No doubt some of you here have traveled 15, 20, 25 miles tonight to be here to this meeting. And no doubt some of you do the same to go to this church or whatever church you may attend, because your concept of the church is of a gathered church, a people who come together in terms of a particular faith, a particular doctrine. And it is because this is the rallying point, that you come together in terms of it. Now, historically, the given type of churches prevailed in Europe. All your European churches, Protestant and Catholic, were given. You went to a particular parish of a Catholic church because you were in that jurisdiction, or to a Dutch Reformed church because you were in that parish, or a Presbyterian church in Scotland because you were in that parish. But in a gathered church, you go in terms of your faith. This is why you are going to a particular church, because while there may be another church closer to you, you feel, I belong to that one in terms of my faith. And today, even with regard to Catholic churches, which longer than any other were given, they are increasingly gathered churches, because in recent years with Vatican II, there has been an increasing line of division between those who stand merely in terms of loyalty to the institution and those who stand in terms of loyalty to the Catholic faith and will have special worship in terms of the Latin Mass, or in some cases they've gone to the Byzantine Rite, but it is a gathered group. Now, when you transfer the same thing to the area of the state, what happens? The state, instead of something which is established, and it's always been there, and by tradition, by authority, it is there, authority comes from the top down, the state suddenly becomes something to establish. You have to start out and establish a state. And of course, when men came to America, even though the Crown gave them charters and there were guidances from London and from Spain and Latin America, still, men had to set out to establish certain guidelines in terms of a new world, in terms of a new situation. And so it created a radically different kind of situation, especially in America, in the United States, where more than anywhere else, men had to establish a pattern of government. Now, an established government solves a lot of problems precisely because it is established. Consider Great Britain. They talk about the British Constitution. Where is it? Well, there is no written constitution in Great Britain. When they speak of the British Constitution, they mean the way of doing things, as over the centuries it has been given to them, so that there is an established pattern, an established tradition in terms of which everything is done. Now, when you have an established pattern, it makes everything simple. You have no problems. Things are done today in Britain the way they have been done in various areas. Generation after generation, and certain traditions are carried on. The changing of the Guards appeals to Americans when they go there. Why? Because the Guards represent so established and entrenched a tradition, they don't change their dress generation after generation. Things are done because that's the way they were always done. But when you set out to establish a government in a colony, in a new country, and then to establish a federal union, you immediately have problems. An uncertain power at times, and a very shifting idea of what is the right way to do this. As a result, very definitely, In the American tradition, there have been major problems that would not have existed in, say, a European tradition, where things are traditional. But in this country, tradition doesn't have deep roots. Established ways are not that old. An old house here is a couple of hundred, maybe in some rare cases, in one or two places in the Americas, more than 200 years old. Out in California, if it's 100 years old, it's very, very old, extremely old. But in Europe, the houses and the buildings can be hundreds of years old, 1,000 years old, and older. The guidelines, in other words, are more difficult in a gathered power. Now the Federalist Papers constructed, first of all, a federal government, and second, they were as much concerned with property right as with political liberties. Freedom for the federal Constitution was not only for persons, but also for property. The Marxists are right. The U.S. Constitution is very much concerned with property. There's no point in us denying that charge. We need to affirm it. The Constitution very definitely has a concept of man whereby man is more than his bare person. The individual, in terms of the Constitution, is not only his person, but his family, his possessions, his contracts. It is the sum total of all these associations, obligations, responsibilities, possessions that constitute his life. However, the men who shaped the Constitution recognized that property interests will create factions. As the Federalist Paper number 10 declared, written by Madison, those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, with many lesser interests, grow up of necessity in civilized nations, and divide them into different classes actuated by different sentiments and views. The regulation of these various and interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation, and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operation of the government. That statement by Madison shows an awareness of the problem. Because you see the people of the state and their liberties in terms of persons and properties, you are immediately creating divisions or factions in people. The haves against the have-nots. The town people against the country people. The manufacturing interests of one kind as against the manufacturing interests of another kind. All kinds of factions are possible, as the Constitution required, recognized. And so the purpose of the Constitution was to try to provide a solution, to try to offer checks and balances to prevent the working of these conflicts. But of course, conflicts arose from the very beginning. In a world of sinful men and imperfect men, one of the surest things we can expect are problems, conflicts. One of the most dangerous things is to feel that we won't get them. Because when we feel that way, we are bound to have trouble. One of the problems with youth today, of course, is precisely this. I was told once by someone who should know, because it's his business, that his big problem with college graduates is that they are looking for a job with all kinds of good pension benefits, good vacation privileges, where they won't have to work hard and where there are no problems. And of course, there are no such jobs. And when you take a job in the assurance or in the belief that it has no problems, you are in for trouble, because this is built in. Now, the whole purpose of the Federalist Papers was to point out that problems are a certain thing. The United States, when it is established, is going to have problems. We are going to try to put in certain instruments into the document to handle those problems. We expect them, but we want them to do the least damage to the country. Well, shortly thereafter, within a generation, there arose in this country a number of deists, Unitarians, Transcendentalists, and other groups, all of whom were characterized by a denial of total depravity. The old Calvinistic belief that man is depraved, the old Christian doctrine, which, while not sharing the Calvinistic belief in total depravity, believed that man is a sinner, was in process of being replaced in a sizable segment of the population with a belief that man is good, man can be trusted. This was a part of the rise of humanism. With this view also was an idea that law is a human product only. Now, from a Christian perspective, we believe that true law comes from God. It is expressed in the Bible. Man's laws must seek to approximate the law of God. But in humanism, law is a human product. As a result, when you view human law and human social arrangements as purely human, this is going to change your attitude towards obedience. If I believe that the laws of the state reflect in some form the law of God and to a degree the will of God, so that the laws with respect to human life reflect God's law, thou shalt not kill, and the laws with respect to property reflect God's law, thou shalt not steal, and traffic laws reflect God's law because they forbid us to kill somebody or to rob him of his property by damaging it, it's going to give me a different view of that law than if I believe all of this is purely a human invention. And there is no absolute moral law requiring me not to kill anybody, nor to steal from anybody. That this simply is a law for the convenience of society to make it easier for men to get along. That certainly, if I have that attitude, I will treat traffic laws with contempt. I will treat your property with contempt, because there is no necessity then for me to respect your property. And the only thing wrong is then what I cannot get away with. In other words, an idea comes in which we can call, using a term from American politics, nullification. Nullification. When you have an idea of law as a human product, you can say that we can nullify the laws of the Federal Union. There is no necessity to obey them when they conflict with our interests or with our state rights or with what we believe. And so you have a doctrine of nullification of federal laws by states. But it doesn't stop there. We don't hear very often in the textbooks about the other side of nullification, because it developed into a very powerful movement in the hands of men like Thoreau and Lysander Spooner. And can anyone tell me what their doctrine was? Lysander Spooner, who again is becoming an extremely popular thinker with the radical New Left on the campuses. And Thoreau. What was their philosophy? What? Did someone say something? Anarchism. All right. So you have nullification of state laws by individuals. Man now takes primacy. Man is sovereign. So that you have a conflict of sovereignties. The sovereignty of the federal union, the sovereignty of the states, or the sovereignty of the anarchistic individual. Three separate sovereignties. And the result, when you have three sovereignties, is conflict. You have a multiplicity of gods, each of which says, I am independent and I can do as I please. Now, of course, we as Christians must regard these positions as false alternatives to the sovereignty of God. All of them are humanistic. They represent, whether you have this kind or this kind of nullification, the sovereignty of man in some form, either as an individual or as a group. And this leads to the totalitarianism of man, of the state or individual. Now, John Witherspoon, during the Continental period, had been emphatic in his need for checks and balances, and over again had emphasized this, so that this indeed became a part of our structure because of the kind of teaching he represented. You will recall when we studied the Constitutional Convention, we saw how many of the men had been trained by Witherspoon. Now, this was Witherspoon's thesis. Pure democracy cannot subsist long, nor be carried far into the departments of state. It is very subject to caprice and the madness of popular rage. Hence it appears that every good form of government must be complex, so that the one principle may check the other. It is of consequence to have as much virtue among the particular members of a community as possible. But it is folly to expect that a state should be upheld by integrity in all who have a share in managing it. They must be so balanced that when everyone draws to his own interest or inclination, there may be an overpoise upon the whole. In other words, John Witherspoon was saying, don't expect anyone you elect to be fair and impartial and always just. He's going to represent himself and whoever he thinks he's strongest. And politicians have always had a habit of saying one thing and doing another and trying to keep a foot in both camps. When Andrew Jackson ran for the presidency, the pro-tariff people were sure, in view of some statements he made to them, that he was on their side, and the anti-tariff people were sure that he was an anti-tariff man. And so they both got to work and elected him. As a matter of fact, a few years after that, not too long before the Civil War, a man became mayor of Boston as a member of the Know-Nothing Party, the candidate of the Know-Nothing Party. Now, the Know-Nothing Party, a very stupid group that for a few years became very powerful in the country and then just as quickly faded, became very strong in Boston because Boston was being flooded with Irish Catholic immigrants. The know-nothings were against all these foreigners. They didn't like the Irish and they didn't like the Catholics. And so this man ran as the candidate of the Know-Nothing Party, as the enemy of Catholicism and the Pope and the enemy of the Irishmen. Now, who was his best friend with whom he'd sit down and have a good chat from time to time? Why, the Irish Catholic Bishop of Boston. He made it his business to be friendly to all sides without being in favor of anybody. So, now this was over 100 years ago, considerably over. So this sort of thing is nothing new in American politics, you see. As a matter of fact, on one occasion, a man ran for office and became a leader of the anti-Masonic party in this country and secretly joined the Masons because he figured when he was in politics it was a good thing to have a hand in both sides. Now, Witherspoon says, in view of the fact that men are sinners, we must recognize that checks and balances are necessary, and even then they are limited in what they can do because men are sinners. And you simply hope that the sins of one will cancel or act as a check to the sins of the others. Along those lines, it's interesting to note that the public hearings of Watergate, that is, the televised hearings, ended when the last speaker, I believe, was Patrick Buchanan. And when they asked him flatly if he didn't know that what they were doing was illegal, he answered the good Democratic senator who asked him that question. He said, "Senator, we were told that we should not break any law of the country unless there was a precedent in the Democrats having done it already, and we hadn't." They didn't want to hear any more from him, you see. And of course, what is the kind of thing that Watergate represents? Precisely the kind of thing that Witherspoon was talking about. They're both sinners up there. They're both doing it, and they use each other as the villain. They're ready to see the sins of the others. And this is, he said, a safeguard. So, Witherspoon says, we need checks and balances because of sin, and second, we need as much virtue as possible in the people. Because without the virtue of the people, certainly, there will be a drastic decline in the character of the people at large. This still, however, leaves problems. Our problems today are precisely because while we have started an answer, we haven't worked out all the problems concerned with that answer, voluntarism in politics. Now let us turn to another answer in Europe that has become a problem progressively all over the world and is a problem to us today. In Europe, the tradition has been for a long time, since the end of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation and the collapse in Europe as far as any practical influence on the political life of the people is concerned, of both Protestantism and Catholicism. Now, this collapse took place about the end of the 1600s. By the end of the 1600s, Europe, while still nominally Protestant and nominally Catholic, no longer was concerned with godly rule. It was no longer geared to the fact that we are interested in creating a Protestant state or a Catholic state. We want our version of a Christian state. No. This they had abandoned. They more and more were influenced by the environment, and their ideas were reflecting the basic premises of the environment, the sovereignty of man. In my Institutes of Biblical Law, I call attention to the difference within the Catholic sphere where it came out very dramatically between Philip II of Spain and Louis XIV of France, a generation apart. When Philip II of Spain built his palace, what was at the center of it? Does anyone recall or know? What was at the center of the palace? No, that was Louis XIV. Yes, that was Louis XIV. The chapel, yes. At the heart of Philip's palace was the chapel. That was the center. The palace was in part a monastery. Why? Because Philip's idea of sovereignty was Christian, and his idea of government was thoroughly religious. And he felt that he needed the counsel of men of the cloth, and he needed the chapel at the center of his palace, so that through worship he could find the kind of guidance he needed to rule. Now, we can disagree with much of what Philip did, and I disagree with 9/10 of it. I think Philip II was very often a very foolish monarch. But the point is that in spite of his blunders and errors through lack of wisdom, his basic principle of rule was Christian. His basic purpose was sound. Whereas Louis XIV, who was a far more brilliant king, and compared to whom Philip was inept, while nominally Catholic, actually made his bedroom the center of the palace of Versailles. This was a real revolution, you see, in outlook. From the sanctuary, the chapel at the center, to the bedroom as the center. The sovereignty of man. But monarchy disappeared before too long. Did that change the picture? Did it make Europe any the less humanistic? No. The great philosopher, great only because of his influence, not because I think he was a great man, because he was very much a scoundrel, who influenced all subsequent thought. Can anyone think of his name? Very powerful philosopher of democracy. Rousseau, yes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, Rousseau, incidentally, was an authority on child training and the education of children. And it's interesting that the modern world regards Rousseau as such an authority as did his day. When I was at the university, I had to read Rousseau's books on education because they were regarded as basic. Rousseau had any number of children. He lived with this woman without marriage. And he couldn't be bothered with the children. And as soon as they were all born, he ordered his mistress to cart them off to the foundling home. Leave them there for the sisters to take care of. It is ironic that he has been regarded as an authority on child education when he couldn't be bothered even with his own children. But Rousseau favored democracy. But the kind of democracy he favored is a very unusual kind, and we need to understand it because it is basic to the modern doctrine of democracy. There is, first of all, the people. Then the will of the people is expressed in the popular will. Now, the popular will is manifested as people vote or in one way or another express themselves. But the popular will is not necessarily the true will of the people. The true will of the people is expressed in the general will. Now, what does that mean? Well, supposing we were to ascertain what the popular will of this group is, and you all decided in favor of something of which I disapproved, and I would say, true, this may be the popular will in that this is what you all favor. But I, as an elitist person, as a wiser person than any of you, know what you truly need. And if you really knew what was in your heart, you would know that I know what is best for you. And therefore, really, the general will of the people, if it were properly expressed, is what I say it is. Now, in terms, therefore, of Marxism, which has carried this to its logical conclusion, you don't even ascertain what the popular will is. First of all, as the elite group, the scientific socialist planners, in the name of the people, you declare what the general will is. And then you offer it to the people on a ballot in which they can only vote yes or no, and God help them if they vote no when you say this is the general will. And you give them a slate with only one candidate for each office. And if they want to vote no on the measure, they have to ask for a special ballot in some cases. So it's obvious that they are counter-revolutionary people. So, well, the general will is very obviously the popular will then. If you knew that I was demanding that you confirm me on something when I say it's the general will, and if you didn't agree, you were all going to be carted out to a prison camp, you would certainly agree with me. You would be very hearty in your agreement, would you not? Now, in terms of this pattern, to get back to our original pattern, this is a given kind of democracy. It is a democracy which, while it is supposedly in the name of the people, is handed down from above. It does simplify matters. It also represents something which modern education is working for. I think many of you have read my book, The Messianic Character of American Education. And this has been the philosophy of the public schools. They give another name to this idea of the general will. Does anyone know what it is? The democratic consensus. The democratic consensus. It's not the democratic majority, it's the democratic consensus which the elitists in Washington determine is what the people really want. And what the educators determine is what is really desired. And so in the name of the democratic consensus, you try to eliminate the popular will as much as possible. You try to get rid of the local school boards. In one state I know of, in the West, the local school board has been abolished. Because the local school board was, they felt, a dangerous institution in that it did not truly appreciate the democratic consensus. The people at the state capitol knew better than the people locally what was going on. Now, to carry this further, this immediately presented some very serious problems. In that, with the democratic consensus, the general will, and so on, seeping into America after the French Revolution. In this country, we have had, therefore, attempts to transform this kind of society into this kind, or to confuse the two. The result has been a progressive problem in terms of the inability of Americans to distinguish between the American system and the European system. The confusion of the voluntaristic with the given, but gathered with the given. The consequence has been that today we have a major problem which developed very early in American history, a confusion as to the fundamental character of the American system. There were a number of men who dealt with this problem. We shall, on another occasion, perhaps tomorrow morning or night, I'll see just when it will fit in best, deal with John C. Calhoun, whose thinking in this area was very important and, in some respects, very much of a problem. Now, obviously, we have some serious problems in this country because of this confusion. And it also has deflected from the ability to solve the problems that are inherent in a system that begins with the faith of the people, with a voluntaristic principle, because it is one in which conflict is built in. Now, this is an important point. Conflict is recognized and built into the Constitution of the United States, because realistically it was something they recognized as inescapable. Thus, the Constitution never envisions a smooth, peaceful, easy situation. It recognizes at all times the inevitability of conflict. It tries to deal with that conflict. The only way you can end conflict is to abandon this kind of system and to come to this kind of system, or the Soviet system, where you say conflict doesn't exist. We have the general will here. If you do not recognize the general will, you go to a labor camp. We cannot have conflict in our society. But we'll stop here to deal with any questions that may be in your mind before we resume our study. Are there any questions?
You mentioned there regarding having a foot in both camps. Can a Christian really run for office and ever win an election without a foot in both camps? And if he has a foot in both camps, can he be a Christian?
Yes, he can run for office on an honest, straightforward platform. He's not going to get very far today. In a few cases, in a few districts, he will. We certainly do have a handful of very superior men in Washington. But of course, the kind of men we have in Washington are a reflection of our character as a people. To a great extent, they are better than we deserve, because we have become radically humanistic by and large. And as a result, the character of politics reflects that to varying degrees. But politics tends to be conservative, even when radicals are there, because politics aims at satisfying everybody, so that it can never move as quickly as the people do. The politician is usually a step behind the people in any direction. A classic story about that is an incident during the French Revolution. This man was sitting in a bar relaxing, a politician, and he saw a mob go rushing down the street, and he jumped up and he says, "There goes the mob. I am their leader. I must catch up with them." See, that is politics. You don't get ahead of the mob, because if you're way out in front, you lose them. But you try to find what direction they're going in and then run and get in front of them when they've already made up their mind which way they're going. So the restoration of the political order has to be a restoration of character. And it also has to be a restoration of the nature of conflict. Now, I'm glad you raised that question, because it once again brings up something we dealt with earlier: Manichaeanism. You'll recall when we dealt with Manichaeanism, we saw that the Manichaeans felt that the material world is the evil world. It is the world of the bad God. And the spiritual world is the world of the good God. And Manichaeanism, a pagan religion, infected the Western world and has been an undercurrent, often infecting the outlook of Christians. Well, for many people, politics is a dirty business. You see. Period. That's it. It's a dirty business. They don't want to be involved in it. And occasionally you find some who feel that it's such a dirty business they don't want to vote. Individuals who feel that way, and some church groups, such as the Amish. It's the evil world out there. We will have no contact with it. But we are not allowed that luxury by the Bible, in that we have an obligation under God to bring every area of life into captivity to Jesus Christ. Any other questions? Well, then we'll take our 5-minute break now.